Hey, what's going on YouTube? Hey, it's Cameron with Motion Science. I am so happy to have you here today. I'm happy to be here today. How is everyone doing on this fine day? How's everyone doing? Today we're talking about creative constraints. How to use creative constraints to improve your motion designs and all that good stuff. But before I get into that, I want to hear from you. Do you limit yourself and do you use constraints when you're creating? That's what I want to know. Do you limit yourself to use creative constraints when you're creating? And if so, how do you use constraints? Please tell me in the chat box. I want to hear from you. I want to know if any of you are using creative constraints. If you're not, that's okay. Some people have a hard time using constraints, but it's super, super important for design. While you're telling me that in the chat box, I'm going to tell those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Cameron. I'm the guy behind Motion Science. I've been a motion designer for over 20 years, working in After Effects and Cinema 4D. I've taught myself motion design. I've taught myself animation. So I should say I've taught myself design and animation. And I have had a very lucrative and successful career in motion design. I was a freelancer for over 13 years. I've owned and operated two small studios, post houses. I've had the opportunity to build projects for studios like Prologue Films and Digital Kitchen, and agencies like Publicis and Ogilvy and Mather. And I've worked with clients like Amazon, 343 Industries, Disney, Microsoft, MTV, RCA Records, Sony, and many, 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 many more. So that's a little bit about me if you don't know who I am. And I want to tell you guys before I look here in the chat box to see if any of you guys have responded to my question. I do have a new challenge starting next week on March 21st. It's a 5-day challenge, and it's called the Motion Design Challenge: How to Easily Concept and Design Style Frames Without Prior Knowledge. It's a 5-day challenge. It's live. It's free. It's me teaching for 5 days and doing Q&As each and every day. It's Monday through Friday. It's a lot like this. It's where I'm sitting here talking to you, but I have like PowerPoint and I kind of explain things and I show you my process as well for designing style frames. So if you want to understand how to create style frames, then you need to definitely check it out. But the only way to check it out is to register for it. It's not open to the public. It's you got to register. It's motionscience.tv/challenge. Hope to see you there. motionscience.tv/challenge. Okay, that's what I got for you. Let's go check out the chat box here really quickly and see who's here. We've got Jake. What's going on, Jake? Happy to have you here, Jake. Let's see here. We've also got Angelica. Thanks for the kind words. I appreciate that. Happy to have you here as well, Angelica. GP, what's going on, GP? Recognize GP from Stylecraft. I believe that's the same GP. And I should say, Jake, I recognize you from Career Coaching Community. Great to have you here. Lloyd is in a couple of my courses and memberships as well. Longtime subscriber. What's going on, Lloyd? Looking forward to the challenge next week. Looking forward to having you. Tor, what's going on, Tor? Greetings from Norway. Awesome to have you here, Tor. Another familiar name. Brandon, I throw everything out of design while keeping the brand in mind in the planning process and then start pulling back from there. Interesting, Brandon. So you just throw everything into the design and then you start pulling back from there. That's an interesting way to approach it. I think personally, I would feel overwhelmed if I was throwing everything into it. But I realize you are keeping the brand in mind. So there is a creative constraint there, right? It's a theme, it's a brand. So that's a constraint for sure. Jake is not familiar with the term creative constraints. Well, I'm going to teach you all about that, Jake. It's going to be a short but sweet lesson today. Same GP, awesome. Eva, what's going on, Eva? Another familiar name. I do not use constraints, but I should. I get off track and go down rabbit holes too easily. That is why we have creative constraints, because we go off on these rabbit holes and it's like we can design forever and ever and it never ends, right? I hear so many motion designers that struggle with just the endless loop of never finishing a project because there's no creative constraints in place. Laurent, Good Times HD. Laurent, hey, what's going on, Laurent? Great to have you here. Jake says, does that just mean to work within boundaries depending on brand standards? Yeah, essentially, yes. But let's say you don't have a brand standard, right? Going back to even what Brandon said. Let's say that you're creating spec work or you're creating work that doesn't have a brand guide, right? Or anything like that. That's when we can put creative constraints into place. Lauren's been using Workflow ever since you showcased it in StyleCraft. Yeah, Workflow is an amazing program. If you haven't checked out Workflow, you definitely do. Let's see here. Angelica, my major constraint is limited time to achieve projects due to close deadlines. Yeah, that's a big constraint, right? Time constraint. We're going to talk about that. And CJ, what's going on, CJ? I like the painting in the back. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay. So really great comments. Happy to see that you guys are using some creative constraints. Some of you aren't. But I think at the end of the day, we always are a little bit. We just may not be super aware of what creative constraints are. So let's talk about a few of them, okay? Let's talk about one. I have several of them listed here in my notes. But the first one I'm going to talk about is color, really briefly. And you may say, well, what are you doing? What do you mean by limiting color? Well, I mean, limit color to maybe three colors, right? In general, and this is just a generalized guideline, but you don't ever really need to go beyond 3 colors. You can have a primary color, you can have a secondary color, and you can have an accent color. And with those 3, you can design just about anything, right? Now, a lot of times I will, in fact, you may have seen some stuff I posted on Instagram recently where I'm using like one color, like very monochromatic. I love to use monochromatic colors, designs actually with like one color. Using 2 colors, you can go a long way, and using a 3rd color, like an accent, can take you very far into design. So sometimes we can approach a design as an open color palette. Not typically a good idea. Let's try to limit ourselves to colors. And maybe the client is giving you some brand colors, which when you're receiving a brand guide from a client, perfect. There's the colors you have to work with. If you don't receive a brand guide, maybe you're creating something for yourself, pick 2 or 3 colors and that's it. And stick to 2 of those colors for the majority of the time, and that 3rd accent color every once in a while. Okay, let's talk about type. You want to limit yourself on type, on typefaces and fonts. You want to limit yourself to 2, maybe 3 typefaces. You don't want to ever go beyond 3 typefaces. The majority of the time, I'm limiting myself to 2 typefaces. A lot of times you can get away with 1 typeface, right? You can get away with a serif and a sans serif. Pairing those 2 together, it's called typeface pairing. Super powerful with what you can design using a serif and a sans serif. If you need to add a 3rd typeface, maybe so. Maybe like for your headline, your subhead, and then the body. Maybe the body is a 3rd typeface, but typically 1 or 2 typefaces is all you need. Another way you can use creative constraints is maybe with shapes, right? This is an exercise I love to do whenever I have downtime and I just feel like creating something. I'll take 2 or 3 shapes, for example, and I'll say, okay, maybe I have a square and a triangle, or a square and a circle. What can I create with that? Just using those 2 or 3 simple shapes. Maybe it's just one shape, right? Maybe I did an exercise in StyleCraft once with circles, and it's just all about what can I create that's interesting just with circles. And you'll be surprised by limiting yourself to maybe 1 or 2 shapes, your mind really starts to push itself creatively, like, okay, what can I do to make this as interesting as possible with 1 or 2 shapes? You know, where can I go? If we have an endless palette of shapes and stars and squares and rectangles and triangles and arrows and whatever it is, it's probably going to be somewhat challenging to get pretty creative with that because there's too many things to choose from, right? And this applies to everything. Just limiting ourselves really opens up our creativeness to, okay, how can we make this look interesting? You can also limit yourself. This sounds obvious, but things like themes or creatives, right? Like if we go back to what Brandon was saying, like in a brand guide, that's a theme, right? Essentially, in another way of putting it. But limit yourself in a theme or a very specific creative. Like I'm going to tell the story of, whatever it is, but like limit yourself, figure out what that is ahead of time. Maybe you need to write that down. Maybe you don't, but limit yourself on themes. This is a big one that I think a lot of people don't actually realize they're doing. But a lot of times when I see work that's put in front of me and asked to critique it, I'll see like a theme of whatever it is happening. And then all of a sudden there's like a secondary theme that comes in, maybe even for something as simple as a transition, right? Where it's a completely separate theme. Like maybe it's a glitchy transition, mixed in with this very parallaxed type. Maybe we see 2 or 3 photos and this is a totally random example, but maybe we see some parallaxing happening, right? And we're moving through these images and all of a sudden there's a transition that's glitchy. It really has nothing to do with what we were just looking at. It's like introducing a second theme to our piece. And that's something we want to stay away from, right? We want to limit ourselves on the themes that we're trying to portray. Another huge one, this is key, time in length, okay? Again, I see a lot of motion designers try to tackle 30-second projects, a minute-long projects. Don't do that, right? Again, now this is coming back to more of your own personal work or work maybe you're creating for a demo reel or something like that, or just work you want to create anyways. Limit yourself in that length of overall time. Now, if a client comes to you and says, we need a 60-second piece, well, you have to deliver a 60-second piece, right? But they're limiting you again. It comes back to their brand guide, their requirements, what they want from you, and they're giving you a time constraint, right? So why not do that for yourself? Why not limit your own overall length of a piece? I tend to prefer 10 seconds or less for a piece. And that's what I would recommend to anyone who's creating personal spec work. Limit yourself to 10 seconds or less, even 5 seconds. Think about putting a demo reel together with spec work. Typically, your shots on a demo reel are pretty quick, right? A couple seconds long. At most, they're typically not more than 5 seconds long, unless you have a very slow-paced demo reel. So limit the length of your motion design pieces. That is huge. You're going to find that by limiting that time, the overall length, that you can really spend a lot more time refining the details and getting those subtleties in there that make your piece that much better. Imagery, okay? Find 3 or 4 images and just run with that, right? I just did some style frame designs and I picked one main image to work with and I picked 2 or 3, I think it was actually 2 secondary images, and one of those was a texture. And this is actually something I'm going to talk about in a later lesson, but I had 3 image assets and I built an entire style frame around that. By limiting my image assets, it opens up my creativeness to problem solve and to make my image as powerful as possible with just a very few images. This applies also to just assets in general. Maybe you want to limit yourself to 1 image, 1 video, 1 typeface, 1 or 2 colors. Limiting the number of assets that you're working with is a creative constraint, right? And this can kind of go back to covering, like I said, multiple things: imagery, shapes, type, color, whatever it is. But just limiting your overall number of assets is huge. Plugins. Do not use third-party plugins unless you absolutely have to, or unless you're further on in your skill set. Stay away from third-party plugins unless you need them for a very specific use case. Okay, so like let's say you're doing a project and it requires some physics to it, right? There's a plugin called Newton out there that does physics within After Effects. So something like that kind of project, yeah, I would look into a third-party plugin like Newton. Or for me personally, I like to use a lot of glows in my work, and I find that After Effects' glow just isn't quite there for me, so I'll use a third-party plugin with a glow, but it's a very specific use case. Don't get wrapped up in having to buy these different third-party plugins, and ultimately I would say stay away from them as you're learning design or trying to get better in motion design. Stay away from third-party plugins. After Effects has so many effects built into it, which brings me to another creative constraint. Use the built-in After Effects effects sparingly and use them at the end of your project, right? I like to use them for the finishing stage. You can design everything around, whatever it is that you're designing, design it. And at the very end, bring in those plugins, those effects that are built into After Effects, like the glow, right? To add a little bit of lighting to your image. I like to finish pieces with adding grain or noise. I like to finish pieces with just a little bit of blur. I like to finish some pieces with chromatic aberration. It just depends, but use them very sparingly at the end to finish that piece. Don't rely on effects and third-party plugins to think that they're going to create this amazing design for you, because they won't. They're just going to create additional frustrations for you as you're trying to design. And I'm trying to alleviate some of these frustrations by limiting the creative assets that you're using. And the last one I want to talk about very quickly, and this is the biggest one of all, add creative constraints to your time. We talked about the overall length of something, but limit your time. What that is depends on whatever it is you're working on. It could be a couple hours, it could be a day, it could be a week, but you need to set a limit, right? A lot of times for myself, I usually spend a day or less. It's usually a half day or less on designing something. If I want to experiment with something, maybe have an idea for a course or just something I want to put out there, and I want to create an image or two for it or an animation or two for it, I'm going to limit myself to about half a day. And then I'm going to step away from it. I'm going to come back the next day or the day after that with some fresh eyes, and then look at it and then decide this is good or it's not good. And if it's good enough, I'm going to refine it a little bit more and add some effects and things like that at that point. But I'm limiting myself, right? Again, something I see motion designers doing all the time is just going over and over things, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, and something is never finished. So you need to set a limit for your time. A couple hours a day, a week, whatever it is. I would never go over a week on anything that's short for yourself. So that's what I got. Those are some creative constraints that you need to keep in mind when designing. And I promise you guys, if you do this, if you use creative constraints, you will be shocked at what you can create. Some of my best creations throughout my career in both style frame design and animation has been because I'm very limited on what I can use. I actually would love it when a client would come to me and say, we got this one image, we got to fill 15 seconds of time, we got an audio track, and we got this typeface. What can you do? And they weren't expecting a whole lot from me, right? But because I loved that challenge of just having this very small amount of assets to work with, could usually shock a client with what I could pull off with that. So it helps, it pushes you to think creatively, but over time, your brain starts to kind of rewire itself to get very quick at doing this kind of stuff and being a lot more creative, right? So it's definitely a good practice to put into place. I had a few more comments here. If you guys have any questions, I would love to hear from you regarding creative constraints. That would be awesome. GP said, pretty new to motion, but as a graphic designer, either the brief keeps me constrained professionally or I write sketch first plan. I also start with many assets, but inevitably always scale back. Yeah, I mean, GP, that's a great point. It's like when I do start to pull assets for a project, I typically pull quite a few, right? And it just depends on the project of what I'm pulling. But I'll pull quite a few, but then I'll very quickly start eliminating and say, no, no, no. And well, great example, when I was designing a style frame for next week's challenge, I started initially with an idea, a theme of a Cold War. I wanted to do like this kind of vintage Cold War piece. And so I pulled some imagery, some soldiers and some documents and things like that, because it was for a fake TV show promo I was putting together, a style frame. And it started Cold War, but it very quickly morphed into like an old Western type of thing. So I had pulled this Cold War imagery, and then I started finding myself pulling like old cowboy vintage kind of things. And it quickly was like, okay, get rid of all this Cold War stuff. Here's 3 cowboy things I can use. And then I was very quickly able to design the style frame based on that. I don't typically write out what I'm going to do. I know a lot of designers who do. I've never been real big on writing. Same with sketching. I've never been one to sketch. I can't sketch, right? I wish I could. But for a lot of motion designers, writing and sketching the plan first is a great plan of attack. But great that you're starting with assets and you're definitely scaling them back. So that's great. Brandon, 3 colors is definitely the way to go. Always use gradients with those to create a new look of color theory. That's awesome tip. Great tip. CJ, being colorblind, using a limited monochrom color palette works really well. That's a great tip as well. A lot of designers are colorblind. It's really surprising. Okay, Tor, as far as creative constraints, mine would be to currently find myself between jobs and doing some freelance work for the time being. It's fine for now, but as an aspiring motion designer, I believe I have a much better peace of mind and consequently less worries, more breathing room for creative with a full-time job, not have to, yeah, I mean, that's a little bit different than what we're talking about today though, Tor. I think, if I'm understanding that right. But yeah, always aspire to be better. Always aspire to be better. That's all we can do. It's been my mantra since day one. I've always wanted to get better at motion design, at my craft, and that is what's also helped push me to get better, to improve my craft. Eva, no questions here. Heartfelt thanks for everything you do for this community. Of course. Okay, well, looks like I am out of questions. So again, I want to talk, or I just want to put this up here really briefly again, if I can. There we go. Free 5-day challenge starts next week. motionscience.tv/challenge. I hope to see many of you there. I've had a lot of people register so far. I think it's going to be an amazing challenge. I know it's going to be an amazing challenge. I've put a lot of work into it, and I'm really proud of what I've come up with for it. I'm still actually putting the finishing touches on it this week, so there's always that. Also, I want to let you guys know that Stylecraft, if you've checked out Stylecraft, I know many of you here are in Stylecraft, and if you're thinking about joining Stylecraft, the registration's opening up March 24th, and it closes April 2nd. So this is your opportunity to get in. While it's open. There will be a limited number of seats because I have a lot of people wanting to get in. So I just want to wrap with this. Oh, actually, see, Jake said great stuff. Really like the time constraint. Nothing worse than beating a dead horse and losing passion for project. Thank you. Looking forward to the next week's class. Awesome. I want to have another question from Abdo. Is Stylecraft more design or After Effects? So it's both, actually. It's heavy on After Effects, a little bit on Cinema 4D Lite, and a lot of Stylecraft revolves around design, right? But we're putting our design into motion in the vast majority of the lessons. So I'm teaching you why it's important to understand design and why it's important that you have good design fundamentals under your belt to be a really great motion designer. A lot of motion designers are focused on the animation side, and that's great. But you also need to understand the design side, right? That's why we are a motion designer. We understand motion and design. Even if you don't want to design, right? It's important that you understand the design side of things, because let's say you start with a composition that's been designed for you and laid out and it's there, and you animate it, right? And when you animate it, you start moving assets around. You start moving things around the screen, and you want to understand where things can end up on screen, where they can be to make the image, the composition still aesthetically pleasing to our eye. And that's super, super important. So it's important that you understand design principles so that your animation can look even that much better. So we do some animation for sure. I focus more on cinematic motion, which means it's more types of movements that are slower and just more epic, I would say, versus teaching you things like, here's how to animate a character, or here's how to use the speed graph in great detail. We've talked a little bit about that, but definitely more on the design side. So, okay. So again, wrapping this up, guys, always remember the best way to get better at motion graphics is to keep creating and practicing, watch other people's work, learn from it. That is key, and find ways you can improve upon it. Stay motivated, experiment with new techniques, and above all else, have fun with your work. With enough practice, you'll become a master of the craft and produce stunning visuals yourself that can capture people's attention. You have a very unique skill that very few people possess. I want to say thank you for being here today. As always, I'm Cameron, and this is Motion Science.